Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind address the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine.
Thank you very much. I'm Philip Emeagwali. The parallels between my supercomputer and an internet is this. My supercomputer encircled a globe that has a diameter of 8,000 inches. The internet encircled planet Earth that is a globe that has a diameter of 8,000 miles. Both my supercomputer and an internet are global networks of processors. The difference is that my supercomputer, that is an internet, is constructed systematically, while the internet grew incrementally and organically, and grew at different times and places. For this reason, namely the lack of uniformity and regularity, the internet as we know it today cannot be the hoped-for planetary-sized supercomputer that could ever be harnessed to find answers to the biggest questions facing humanity. If such a planetary-sized supercomputer can be constructed by our descendants, they could harness it to solve their grand challenge initial boundary value problems, such as those governed by the primitive equations of meteorology and other geophysical fluid dynamical problems arising in their extreme scale computational physics. Please allow me to describe the eureka moment that I discovered, namely that practical parallel processing will bring into existence a new supercomputer that will replace the old vector processing supercomputer. That was the moment that I understood my constructive reduction to practice of the massively parallel supercomputer to be the vital technology that must underpin every supercomputer that will be manufactured in the future. It was 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July 1989, and across a new internet that was a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. Each processor was akin to a tiny computer. I was speechless because I had recorded a previously unrecorded supercomputer speed of 3.1 billion calculations per second. I was shocked, and I stared in awed silence and disbelief. 3.1 billion is impossible, I kept saying to myself. My recording of that previously unrecorded supercomputer speed of 3.1 billion calculations per second implied that a general circulation model used to foresee otherwise unforeseeable climate changes that formerly took 180 years to run at computer speeds of 47,303 calculations per second per central processing unit can now be computed in only one day across a new internet that is a new global network of 65,536 central processing units. On the 4th of July 1989, no supercomputer scientists believed that I could parallel process 3.1 billion calculations per second and parallel process a grand challenge problem and do so across the slowest 64 binary thousand processors in the world. Shortly after my Eureka moment, it made the news headlines that an African supercomputer genius in the United States has discovered how to solve grand challenge initial boundary value problems and how to solve them by chopping each problem into 65,536 smaller problems. I mapped those smaller problems in a one problem to one processor corresponded manner and mapped them to my as many processors. My experimental discovery of the massively parallel supercomputer made the news headlines because it was magic, wizardry, and science fiction back in 1989. Because practical parallel processing was then believed to be impossible, every vector processing supercomputer scientist that I told that I had parallel processed a grand challenge problem believed that I had made an embarrassing mistake. For 3 months, I also wondered if I had made an embarrassing mistake. In the 1980s, I massively parallel programmed 16 ensemble of up to 2 raised to power 16 processors that each tightly encircled a globe. Each of my ensemble was a new internet that I visualized as my new global network of up to 65,536 tightly coupled processors that shared nothing. By the late 1980s, I had programmed more processors than any person that ever lived. For a decade, the reality was that the potential to execute the fastest recorded supercomputer calculation and execute them across the slowest processors was on my fingertips. It took me nearly a decade, from the early 1980s to the late 1980s, for parallel processing to sink in and for me to gain the scientific maturity that I needed to solve real-world problems and solve them across my new internet that was a new global network of 64 binary thousand processors. My contribution to the development of the computer is this. I figured out how a new global network of 65,536 processors that outlined a new internet can synchronously communicate together as a virtual supercomputer and simultaneously compute together to yield a 65,536-fold jump in supercomputing speed. I was in the news in 1989 because I figured out how to make the impossible to compute possible to compute. The news headlines described me as the Nigerian supercomputer genius in the United States that figured out how to parallel process the toughest problems arising in calculus, algebra, and physics. My supercomputer wizardry resided in the never-before-seen manner that I programmed my 2 raised to power 16 processors. The new knowledge that I contributed to calculus, algebra, and physics. My supercomputer wizardry resided in the never-before-seen manner that my 2 raised to power 16 processors, that I programmed my 2 raised to power 16 processors. The new knowledge that I contributed to calculus, algebra, and physics is this. I discovered how to integrate the smaller pieces of a grand challenge problem and how to do so across a small internet that is a new global network of 65,536 tightly coupled commodity off-the-shelf processors, with each processor operating its own operating system and with each processor having its own dedicated memory that shared nothing between each other. I was surprised to see that my invention of practical parallel processing meant a lot to many people. My world's fastest supercomputer speed struck a chord in people across Africa. In the 1980s, the words supercomputer and internet was not in the vocabulary of the African newspaper. It was then a novelty to read about a Nigerian supercomputer genius who was at the farthest frontier of human knowledge. It touched their nerves that I worked alone for 16 years despite the rejections. I invented practical parallel processing that in turn was a major invention of the 20th century. As a black inventor, I was not allowed to be the inventor of my invention. My processors, each akin to a small computer, did not program themselves. I hand-coded each computer with pinpoint precision and wrote its email primitives. I was in the news headlines because I parallel processed across my new internet that was outlined by a new global network of 65,536 small computers. Studying physics is not the most noteworthy contribution to human progress. However, contributing new knowledge to physics, such as parallel processing, is a noteworthy contribution to human progress. My contribution to physics is this. I discovered how to use the slowest computers in the world to solve the toughest problems in the world. I discovered how to solve grand challenge problems and how to solve them in a one problem to one processor corresponded manner, and how to solve them after I had chopped each grand challenge problem into 65,536 smaller problems. That supercomputer breakthrough that made the news headlines enabled me to solve in only one day and across my new internet what formerly would have taken 65,536 days or 108 years to solve on only one computer. I hand-coded my parallel processed solution to the grand challenge problem of supercomputing, and I did so to deliver the highest performance ever recorded on a supercomputer. At 8:15 in the morning of the 4th of July 1989, I was speechless when I saw the experimental results of my decade-long quest, namely the world's fastest calculation across my new internet that was my virtual supercomputer. To discover a new equation is to gaze across the millennia. My contributions of 9 new partial differential equations of modern calculus and to humanity's knowledge of mathematical physics and extreme scale computational physics was the culmination of a body of mathematical and scientific contributions that were made by my mathematical ancestors and made across the millennia. The oldest recorded contribution to mathematical knowledge was recorded 3,700 years ago. That contribution was written in a papyrus and written by Hermes. African geometers such as Euclid, who is the father of geometry, were influenced by African arithmeticians such as Hermes, who is the first arithmetician that we know by name. Hermes lived 14 centuries before Euclid and lived in the same region, that is the valley of the River Nile in Africa. The introductory geometry that you studied as a teenager has its mathematical roots in ancient Africa. Geometry is the contribution to mathematics of ancient Africa. That mathematical contribution was historically preserved by Islamic scholars that studied in North Africa. That contribution was preserved across the ages and transmitted and built upon for thousands of years and along the 4,100-mile valley of the Nile that was the birthplace of Egyptian civilization. Fast forward 2,300 years from Euclid. For the record, Euclid was an African geometer, and there is no record that Euclid ever traveled outside Africa. There is no record that Euclid is not a black African. Fast forward from Euclid in Africa to 1989 to another African mathematician in the United States, Philip Emeagwali. I was the cover stories of top mathematics publications. My discovery stories were about my contributions of new calculus, new algebra, and new mathematical physics to mathematical knowledge. My contributions to mathematics began as a theory or as an idea that was not positively true and materialized as the world's fastest computer.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.